From Boca Raton, Florida, Rabbis Efrem Goldberg, Philip Moskowitz, and Josh Broide are taking you behind the Bima. The BRS rabbis schmooze about contemporary issues and talk to special guests who give a behind-the-scenes look at how they got to where they are and what keeps them going. Welcome to Behind the Bima.
Good evening, Wednesday evening, 9 p.m. sharp. I'm Rabbi Efrem Goldberg, joined by my colleague and co-host, my dear friend, Rabbi Josh Broide. And we're here to take you
behind the Bima.
Behind the Bima. It's Wednesday night, 9 p.m. Where else would you be? Got another great conversation tonight. But first, a big thank you to our sponsor, our friend Michelle Diamond, who has sponsored in honor of the first Yahrzeit in memory of our dear, dear friend Chaim Diamond. Zichrono Livracha. Chaim was a really, really special person, a special friend. He was somebody who wrestled with Hashem. He was taken from us way too young, dedicated his life as an educator towards children. He was sincere. He was real. He was raw. He was just a dear, dear friend. And our community still very bereft without him, taken way too soon. But we're grateful to Michelle and the Diamond family for sponsoring tonight and giving us the opportunity to talk about and think about and remember Chaim.
Yeah, I can't believe it's been a year already. It seems like just yesterday.
It is hard to believe.
Big loss.
Painful and tragedy. Huge loss. We continue to also dedicate all of our programming and learning in honor of a refuah shlema for Esti Moskowitz, Esther Tehila Bas Ariel Tzipora, and we urge everyone to please join our one-on-one campaign. $1 a day of tzedakah through our daily giving partner, and a minute a day of learning. WhatsApp group. So far, I think a minute 14 is the longest it's been, 72 seconds, 74 seconds, but it's really 1 minute of everybody has $1 a day and a minute a day. We've about 140 people who've signed up. Sounds impressive, but it's pathetic.
But we got to listen, it's about $10,000 a day we're giving out. We're so close to 10,000.
We're getting close. We're getting close. But you know what? There are a million people who love the Moskowitzes and who are rooting for Esti. And I don't know, I get a million texts a day that say, what can we do for them? This is what you could do for them. Right. Moskowitz is getting alert every time someone signs up, gives them enormous strength, chizuk, to know people care. You got $1 a day. You got a minute a day. Just go to brsonline.org/1and1, brsonline.org/1and1. The Moskowitzes, I can tell you, it is super meaningful for them. And please God, it is in the merit. Esti should have a speedy and a painless, complete refuah shlema, together with all those who are ill.
Yeah, we miss them. Hope they come back soon.
I miss him terribly. You know, doing this with you ain't easy, Broide. We miss Rabbi
Shavuos without him was not easy.
No, it's life is different. You know, when you're missing your dear friends, like missing an organ, you're missing a piece of your body, you're missing a piece of your community. It's really difficult. But please God, he'll come bouncing, roaring back with Esti's good health, and we're looking forward to that. Daily Giving is also sponsoring a women's concert coming up, where they're actually having a collective davening for Esti and mentioning this campaign. So if you haven't signed up, no excuse. $1 a day, minute a day means the world. And your sign up, I mean, I don't want to be melodramatic, but who knows which person who signs up, which dollar and which minute will make the difference for Esti and for the other people that we're davening for and thinking about.
It's really amazing. It's really amazing. You don't know.
You don't know.
I signed up. I'm doing it. If I can do it, then you know it's easy. You know?
Absolutely. Listen, you signed up for the daf.
I can do it. Anyone can do it.
You signed up for one-on-one. Really, really special. So we're grateful. We're always grateful. Saw an interesting clip. Yeah. Saw that Jake Tapper of CNN was on, I think, Stephen Colbert. The clip was making the rounds. And Jake Tapper was reporting from Ukraine. And, you know, we did a couple episodes where we were directly interviewing people live from the Ukraine on the run. And it's really sad how much it's fallen out of the news and out of the headlines. This is the nature of life and the news cycle. For the people most affected, they haven't moved on.
No, you know, I just met the Chabad rabbi of Ukraine is in our community. He's staying.
Yeah, the two Chabad rabbis from Ukraine who are in Boca Raton. It's still going on. So Jake Tapper was talking about always like to report from there, and Stephen Colbert was showing pictures of him. And one of the pictures he showed of him is wearing tefillin and asking about Passover. So Jake Tapper said, "You didn't see this?"
No.
Jake Tapper.
I'm always the last one to see everything.
Jake Tapper, who I think is a graduate of Camp Ramah, he says, "This was the first year of my life I didn't have a Seder." He goes, "But I'm lucky. I got a Seder in a box." This is what he says. He goes, "There's an Orthodox rabbi who stayed in Ukraine to help people, and he gave me Seder in a box. And Jake Tapper says, I gave matzah to Zelensky, to the president of Ukraine, because he's Jewish. And then Jake Tapper says the following line. He goes, of course, there's an Orthodox rabbi, there's Chabad in Ukraine in the middle of a war. He goes, I think that when man lands on Mars, you're going to be greeted by a Lubavitch rabbi who says, hi, welcome. What can I get for you? That's what Jake Tapper says.
I love it.
And so look at that, Chabad. It's amazing.
Yeah. Hear the full story with Jake Tapper next week on Behind the Bima.
We should.
We should. If anyone has a connection.
We should. No, we've got a great lineup this week, next week, and for the future. But we could probably squeeze Jake Tapper in if we had the opportunity to talk to him about that, his Jewishness and that trip. So that was a great story. Great. We're big fans. We love Chabad. We are Chabad. We are everybody. We're YU. We're Lakewood. We're Chabad. We're everybody. But Chabad all over the world, and not only when it's easy. We have we've spoken about our Beis Din for Geirus. We met today. We have some new Jews, really beautiful, did a conversion today and met candidates, including the Chabad rabbi, who's become our good friend from the Cayman Islands, who's brought us a few candidates. So not everybody gets the Cayman Islands or South Florida or the Bahamas. There are people who get the assignment that it ain't easy. So being in Ukraine in the middle of a war and staying back, that's not an easy assignment.
How do they decide? You get to go to the Bahamas and you're going to Ukraine.
Right, who goes where? But it's amazing. If you know Chabad rabbis, they're equally excited. Wherever they're going, they're equally excited. They're equally excited. So we have tonight a conversation, special guest co-host, my wife, Rabbi Yocheved, conversation with Elisheva Liss, who's a marriage and family therapist, lecturer and author, and really, really interesting. Before we share that interview, that conversation about marriage, about life, about so much personal growth, I was talking today to a friend of ours in our community who's been married for 67 years. 67 years. So in the conversation with Elisheva, we're going to ask her about, the role, the importance of expressing affection in marriage, appropriately so, but for children to see that love or to tell, or love languages, these are really, really important. So he told me, I'm not going to reveal who it is, obviously, but he said, he had been married for a very short time. So this goes back almost 70 years.
You're saying in addition to the 67?
Yeah, he had been married. No, 67 years.
Same
from the very beginning. Okay. So it goes back 67 years.
Gotcha.
And comes on one day and his wife is sad. He says, what's the matter? She says, do you love me? And he says, I'm crazy about her. This is what he tells me today. 67 years. He goes, I'm madly in love with this woman. I'm crazy about her. He goes, it broke my heart. And I became determined then. And he said, for the last 67 years, I've been determined to never let her ever doubt or worry. So every day I tell her. Every day I communicate. Wow. Every day I make sure. I don't want her to ever have that doubt, ever have that worry. She needs to know how much I love her.
Maybe just for this, that was worth tuning in tonight.
No, it was amazing. Yeah, and he's really a role model. And, unfortunately, he's in great health, but his wife, unfortunately, is not. And he said to me, she took care of me for the first 67 years. It's my job to take care of her for the rest of the ride. Wow. And it was just so stoic and so romantic. And, the love doesn't wane. These are more than octogenarians. We're talking about people older than that, in their 90s. And just there's a lot of lessons to be learned. A lot of young people think they have all the answers, or we have the research, the studies. But there's a lot of wisdom.
Look at the picture that I posted on Facebook of me and my wife. Look what we're doing. It's a different world. No, I'm saying not me. I'm saying like what all the young people. I was about
to check out.
No, I'm like, I haven't posted anything in a year, but But you think about what people are showing off, and what there's, I guess, the facade, and then there's what's real. It's very nice to hear.
We're still thinking about our friend. Let's get Gershon married.
That's
our
right.
Good friend, most eligible bachelor, great chef. If you drive at night and you're interested in eating well, and you have a big heart, and ready for somebody with a big heart, let's get Gershon married. So anyway, that was an interesting interaction. A lot for us to learn from. Yeah.
Speaking about learning from, you're coming off a high of Shavuos. I mean, probably one of the busiest holidays in terms of your rabbinic year.
Yeah.
A couple of classes, just a couple of drushes.
Voice is just coming back. Voice is just starting to come back. It was, in some ways I never worked harder, but in some ways I never felt better, stronger, or more proud. Every corner of our campus was alive. It was incredible. Every room, every age, every background, men, women, teenagers, together, separate, girls. It was a classes, chavrusas. We had a siyum, a community siyum. We learned for an hour. We divided up in Sechasota, and 2:45 a.m., 3 a.m., singing and dancing. It was just packed classes every day, morning, afternoon, evening. And it's not me, a lot of rabbis get up and they teach. It's the community of people who want to grow. The response and the attendance and the participation and the inspiration. I'm inspired. This is my job. I love it. It's the greatest job in the world, but it's my job. But the people who come, participate and learn and show up, I'm inspired by the community of people growing.
We had a dinner on Friday night after Friday Night Live, and I challenged everyone. I do this every year. No one ever takes me up on the offer. I said, we have this great learning program tonight, 11 p.m. or 11:30 it begins and goes all through the night. There'll be food.
Right.
And this one guy, Michael, he says, I'll meet you, half hour before your class. We did a little preview, did a little learning together. And he said to me when he walked in that he would be the only one in the shul. Like he thought, what maniacs are going to show up? It's probably him and a group of guys, small group. Right. He walked in, his mind just exploded when he saw
1,000. I don't know how many people were here. It was amazing.
He was really blown away. He says,
by the way,
he never would have expected that.
By the way, Ken Spiro was at Rabbi Gibber for Shavuos. And he said he was great. We had somebody walk in looking for Ken Spiro, but Rabbi Gibber told me he also had a fantastic Shavuos. I'm sure Rabbi Bufsky, all the rabbis, it was great all around. So very excited to be able to welcome Elisheva Liss. She's a licensed psychotherapist, marriage and family therapy, treats individuals. She writes, she has courses, lessons, a lot of wisdom. You can find her at elishevaliss.com, Elisheva, Liss.com. She uses social media to best use, which is to teach, inspire, and elevate, not self-promote. You can find her on all the social media platforms as well. And it's a really great conversation. Without any further ado, it's a privilege and pleasure to welcome her. To be joined by Elisheva Liss, a fairly long-time friend of ours, of our community, a recent resident of Boca Raton, not Montoya Circle, not everybody's zocha to live on Montoya Circle itself, but still connected to Boca Raton. Elisheva, it's great to be together. It's great to be able to have this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
So we have a lot to talk about. Your expertise as a marriage family therapist. You are prominent on social media, sharing wisdom and insight and challenging and provoking people to think. You're an author. There's so many areas to cover. But why don't we start with this? You recently tweeted a sentence. You said, it's worthwhile to be the kind of person with whom it's safe to disagree. What did you mean by that? It's worthwhile to be that type of person. And what does it look like to be safe to disagree?
It's funny. That was a tweet that got retweeted a lot more than I expected. I'm not very active on Twitter. Well, I use Twitter as more of like a storage for the things that I'm going to elaborate on later in other media. So there's not a lot of action on my Twitter account, but that one got retweeted a lot and elicited a lot more response. And I'm really not good at predicting which statements, blog posts, articles are going to kind of touch a nerve that way. Sometimes I think that I'm picking up on something really important and it doesn't really get a lot of response. And then sometimes like this, it was sort of an afterthought. It didn't feel like a very original thing to say, but it elicited a lot of response. So what I meant by that is that, particularly in the contemporary, philosophical culture that we find ourselves in, and I think this is true societally, religiously, politically, there's a tremendous amount of polarization. There's a tremendous amount of talking about the polarization and a lot of dysregulated feelings about a lot of different opinions that are very relevant to our lives. And I find myself feeling more and more hesitant to disagree with people, not even just in the public sector, because obviously that's going to be more charged, but even privately, I find myself being more and more discerning about people with whom I bother to disagree, even in polite conversation. And it got me thinking about, I have strong feelings, I have passionate, opinions about things, and I want to try to be careful to be someone with whom it's okay to disagree. And I'm sure there are people who don't feel comfortable to disagree with me, and I try to work on that humility. But I also feel like I almost want to invite that, because I feel like good relationships and good dialogue and good change comes as a result of having sort of a semi-permeable membrane of a brain, being willing to hear and learn and challenge ourselves on the basis of what, at least I'll speak for myself, what I can learn from people who disagree with me.
So paint a picture for us. What are the key ingredients? What does it look like to be the type of person others are comfortable disagreeing? Is it about how you listen? Is it about how you respond? Is it the decibel level that you speak at? Is it how authoritative you are with your opinions? What does it look like to be the type of person? And I assume you're talking about in marriage, parenting and children, with coworkers, in every sphere of relationship. all of us can grow in that area. What does that look like? What should we be working on?
I really didn't prepare to delve so deeply into this, but I'm going to answer on the fly.
In Elisheva's defense, we don't provide questions in advance on Behind the Bima. We have informal, spontaneous conversations. So in Elisheva's defense, but go ahead. I'm sure it'll still be well thought out.
I guess I find that, the older I get, I hope the more I learn. I hope the more I try to mature and grow, but also the less sure I am of opinions that I held very strongly over the years on a variety of different topics. And I just find that if I can disagree with the myself of a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 10 minutes ago, then maybe I should be a little more humble and a little more open and receptive. So in terms of answering the question of what it looks like to be someone with whom it's safe to disagree, I guess one thing would be to watch reactivity. So when I'm having a conversation, usually with somebody that matters, having a conversation with a stranger on social media isn't going to be that important, but conversations with our family members, our spouses, our coworkers, our clients, students, neighbors, friends, people in our lives with whom those relationships matter. I think sometimes you can almost feel the squirt of adrenaline in your brain when somebody says something that feels like a threat, either a threat personally or a threat to what I believe to be true and important. And to be able to just kind of notice that trigger of anger or agitation or insecurity or jealousy, it could be any one of a number of different emotional responses that we feel within ourselves, and to get that in check and just sort of say, okay, something's going on inside of me right now, but let me take a moment here, let me take a beat to just kind of figure out what this person is saying without getting my dukes up, without getting emotional or explosive about it, and just sort of say get curious, what do you mean by that, or can you explain? Or if I have clarity on what they're saying, wow, I really see it differently. Can I share my perspective, and you tell me what you think about that?
It's interesting because I feel like in our world, in our firm world, there's a whole dichotomy, because on one hand, on social media today, a lot of people are very comfortable sharing their disagreements, sharing their opinions. And then you have another community of people who feel like they shouldn't be different. They shouldn't share. They shouldn't, deviate from what the community norm is where they live, or the societal expectations, and they feel they can't disagree or speak out. So it's such an interesting dichotomy of some who do very vociferously and some who feel they can't and are silenced. So it's just an interesting balance of when and how. And
it's so interesting what you're saying, because it's really true. And I think some of us feel both. I think, depending on the context. I was reading over Yontif, we're recording this the day after Shavuos, and I was reading Rabbi Sacks's, I think the book is called Letter in the Scroll, something like that. Mm-hmm. And he had this gorgeous paragraph where he described his writing as so delicious. But he had written something about how, I'm not going to do it justice, but how Jews have simultaneously championed individualistic values before it was trending. Avram Ha'ivri whole world was on one side and he was on the other, and also fought for collectivistic responsibility during times when the zeitgeist is more about promoting the needs of the individual. And I think that's kind of what you were alluding to, Yocheved, the feeling of on the one hand saying we define ourselves sometimes by being willing to sort of b'makom she'en anashim ish, and also not wanting to be porish min hatzibur, and it's the same Pirkei Avos that teaches both, and I think a lot of us are walking that line as the world becomes more intensely charged and polarized, again, in the religious sphere, but not only the religious sphere. Everything just feels really intense these days.
So speaking about communication and communication challenges in every arena, but let's focus in on marriage for a moment. So people they talk about the shidduch crisis. And there is crisis, may be the wrong word, maybe an insensitive even word. There are certainly challenges in that area, but there also seems to be a marriage crisis going on. And this is your area of expertise. You're a therapist dealing with that informally. I, as a rabbi, Yocheved as a rebbitzin, are often connected with couples who are going through tension and challenges. The marriage crisis doesn't seem to be spoken about as much as shidduch or other, or at least not framed in that way as a crisis. And on top of that, there's an intimacy crisis. And this is your true area of expertise. We're not going to speak explicitly now about it, those details, but just bigadol in general, these issues of marriage and of intimacy. What can we be doing better? Not only waiting until that crisis arises. What can we be doing already in high school, in yeshiva, in seminary, chassid and kala classes, at the beginning of marriage? what are the trends that we can see in advance and try to train or teach or cut off to begin with? How can we raise better future husbands and wives sensitive to the issues that marriage is about, so that we can all be people comfortable to agree, to disagree, to connect, to converse, to be vulnerable, to be intimate, to be connected with?
I love that question. I you know that I'm a homeschooling parent, and for the literature sort of curriculum, I use the word curriculum really loosely here, for my children, I encourage them to read a lot of books that promote emotional intelligence. We did almost no Shakespeare. We try to focus on reading material that's, well written, that's going to promote eloquence, but also that is going to feed the heart and the mind and the soul, and not just make for interest academic repartee. So I think that and I think a lot of schools and yeshivas and seminaries are getting on this now. I want to give credit where credit is due, that I think there has been an appropriate amount of noticing this on behalf of Jewish leaders, that, we need to do a better job preparing people to have healthy and in touch relationships with ourselves, with themselves for young people, and also to be more attuned to the Ben Adam Lachavero. Marriage is a unique relationship in terms of its exclusivity. But a lot of the skills that make for a good marriage can absolutely be practiced in other relationships before marriage. Conflict resolution, being patient, being respectful, being receptive, being open, empathy. There's a tremendous amount that can be done to foster better relationship skills before marriage, even in elementary and high schools. Even I think as parents, modeling how we speak to each other in front of our children and how we speak to our children. I think we're always learning new wisdom about parenting. We are, all three of us, I think, are at a relatively similar stage of our parenting, where our youngest are becoming teenagers, right? And our oldest are adults. And I know for myself, a challenge that I find at this stage of life is there's all this really beautiful parenting inspiration and wisdom coming out. And it's like, oh no, my kids are getting big. Like, do I get to rewind and do over some of this? Because I know I've made a lot of mistakes. But we can only go forward. We can't go backwards. So I think, really education, as Jews, we always believe learning is kind of like the beginning to everything, right? Like we learn so that we can almanat lassos. And and so I think, better modeling, better educating, better discussing, better reading, preparing people for all the different parts of marriage would be wonderful. And it is wonderful. I think it's happening.
So what are the questions? How do I get back to you in 1 second? I'm sorry. I just wanted to follow up with this one. So in back to the shidduch question then, and trying to predict or trying to position our children, ourselves, to have the best marriages later, what are the questions that should be asked? This is one of my favorite topics. I regularly get questions that shouldn't be asked. And it seems that the questions that should be asked are not. If there were parents listening, or young men and young women themselves, who we hope are involved in the experience of trying to choose and look for their mate, their spouse, what are the questions that should be asked that are indicative of whether there'll be a healthy marriage, that should not be neglected or looked over, but they are the cornerstone of a healthy marriage? What kind of things would you encourage people to be asking that typically they're not asking?
I don't know if you're going to like my answer. I have the luxury that I can answer this as a almost purely theoretical as a therapist, because Baruch Hashem, my children have not started dating yet. So ask me in a couple of years, I might completely change my tune here. I find that in my limited, exposure to this, but it's not so limited, because I do, work with the, people who are dating and married. The conversations that take place behind the back of the two people who are actually dating, I find them to be largely irrelevant and inaccurate. I think a lot of people end up going on dates who, really end up in retrospect having been incompatible just because of the way information is presented and interpreted for and about them. A lot of people probably miss out on going out with people because the way information is that may have been a good idea for them to go out with, because of the way information is tossed around between all the other, second and third hand people speaking maybe different languages, even though it's the same words. I happen to be more of a proponent. I apologize if this sounds cynical, but I think sometimes that shidduchim is the crisis. The way we've set things up is just so dysfunctional in a lot of ways. And I would prefer to empower the young people to get to know each other and not rely so much on the gossiping of people behind. I know it's not halachically gossip, but, relying on what people are saying behind their backs and interpreting and pontificating and trying to predict about their future relationships, and instead kind of get to know each other and figure out what's going on between them in the space of the conversations that they have while they're getting to know one another. And then at that point, kind of go back to their mentors, the people that they trust, and say, well, this came up between us and this is what he or she said. And I'm processing and wondering and kind of trying to figure out if I agree with that, if that's something that I'm looking for in terms of going forward, how that would iterate into a relationship later on. But I think the theoretical of people, and I know I'm sounding strong, you can edit it out if you need to, but of people trying to play God about, do you think that he's going to make a good, he's 21. And what do you think it would, nobody could have predicted what I was going to be at 21. And so I feel that's another really a space where we could have a little bit more humility. I mean, I think it should go without saying, but it doesn't, that there are some very personal kind of questions that are just completely disrespectful and inappropriate to be asking, and that don't tend to elicit honest answers anyway. And I think the questions that we want to see people asking about midos, about simchas hachayim, about relational intelligence and emotional intelligence, that often the sources that are listed on shidduch resumes might not be qualified to answer either about that person or in general. So that's why I have a fair amount of skepticism about the whole process of getting people to talk about each other to determine,
But that's what you tell someone to look for. So if a girl or guy were going out on or starting their dating path or career, if they said to you, what should we be looking for? Aside from getting to know, and aside from having fun, and aside from ordering Diet Coke with or without ice, what are the qualities I should be looking for, which will be indicators of whether this will make a good spouse?
So actually, I, with permission, I want to give a little bit of a shout out there. Rabbi Ari Wasserman, who, among other things, he hosts the Halacha Headlines podcast sometimes. He told me, he had shared with me that he's giving a class, and I think it's SciSim School of Business, where he's called something like Designing Your Orthodox Life. And he spent a significant amount of time talking to different therapists and rabbanim, trying to get answers to this question and present it to young men who are in the parsha of dating. And I think that's just an incredible initiative, talking to people who are at this stage where they're dating or starting to think about dating. And so he had asked me to video a little blurb for that. And so we had talked about that. And something that I've written about is kind of for general categories of compatibility: intellectual, emotional, physical, and spiritual. Right. So we want the intellectual compatibility. So meaning if somebody is I have to live in Israel, I already made Aliyah, and, you're going to go set them up with someone who just started, a New York-based business that only works based on New York business law and whatever, so that doesn't make intellectual sense, right? They want different things out of life. So if they're going to go ahead and fall in love, then one of them's going to have to give up on their, plan of where they want to live. That would be a concrete example of it has to make intellectual, proper, logical, rational sense. So that would be one form of compatibility. Does this make sense? Do they want to do the same things in their lives? And then there's emotional compatibility. And this is something that I think in certain communities, they encourage young people to pay more attention to than others. But the feeling of do I enjoy spending time with them? When I see their name coming up on my caller ID, am I oh yeah, it's them? Or oh, whatever, I'll call them back later. Does that, what do they feel like when they're with them? And that's, you don't have to justify that. That's not a moral judgment. It's just, you can't always explain why you enjoy certain people's company and certain other people you don't. But, and we try to be nice to everyone, but you don't have to marry everyone. So
that also comes from dating. I'm saying that also comes from spending time together. It
definitely can. But I think that for the majority of people who are self-aware, there is an element of like an intangible chemistry piece that sometimes within a few minutes of talking to someone, whether they interest you or not. And, we can be proven wrong. It's not unheard of to be oh, when I first met them, I didn't really like them so much, or I thought they were boring. But then one time, they opened up and it really got much more, interesting and fun. But I don't love it when I hear people say oh, I'm dating this person and I really am not enjoying them, but they're everything what I'm looking for on paper. So I guess I should keep it going. So that's where I worry about waiting for it to come. But yeah, again, that's sort of the balance, recognizing how you feel, around them and when you're with them and when you're thinking about them. And yeah, these things are subject to change, but like ideally when you're dealing with young people who still have like a whole life ahead of them and you know, and a pool of people with whom to date, you know, that's something to pay attention to, like how you feel about, you know, them and being with them. There's the spiritual. You want to know that your values align, which doesn't mean that you have to fall in the exact coordinates of the hashkafic stripe, that, you know, exactly the same thing. Oh, I wanted a guy who's going to learn for, you know, 2 years and 4 months, and he wants to learn for 2 years and 3 months. So probably he's not stark enough for, you know, so, you know, but, you know, the general values and what's important and what's, you know, what you feel impassioned by. And of course, religious affiliation is important within a, you know, within a certain margin of flexibility. And then there's the physical. So the physical could be, you know, romantic attraction, sexual attraction, you know, a feeling of like, you know, feeling like they're attractive to you. And also what I incorporate into the physical is also the financial, because it's not so much fun to talk about money, but I think it is important to talk about money, just socioeconomic things that people are used to, their expectations, their aspirations, you know, how things are managed, how material decisions get made. I think it's just, and again, you don't have to be on the exact same page as someone about this, but I think it's important to be able to have conversations about it. But I think one of the most important qualities to look for almost universally in a spouse is openness and flexibility. And that kind of goes back to the tweet that you mentioned, you know, is that if you're married to someone who is really impervious to, you know, being willing to say, you know what, maybe I was wrong about that, or, you know, this is what I thought, but like, tell me what your opinion is, or, you know what, I'm sorry, I really didn't handle that well, and I'm sure that hurt you. That's awful. I don't want to do that again. You know, if the ability, the humility, the flexibility to say, like, I wanted to do A, B, or C, but I see that that's not really going to work for you. So let's revisit that and try something different. I think that's one of the most critical tools to have in order to be a good spouse. And also, you know, whenever we talk about what to look for, it's also important to remember what to be, right? Like, I can't demand somebody who's going to be flexible and be like, I need someone really flexible because I'm completely obstinate and stubborn and I will never give in, right? But, you know, I think, you know, being able to sort of say, like, I want someone who is open to conversation, and that, yeah, we have our things that we care very strongly about that we don't want to compromise on. But, you know, my husband and I laugh, like, both of us were only going to marry people who were 1000% for sure going to always live in Israel. Okay, here we are.
You know what's interesting about that is I'm thinking of your list, and when it comes to reading a shidduch and going on a date, the first and the third, you know, the intellectual, that everything lines up, and the hashkafa, spiritual, are like very much considered, but the other two are completely not, because obviously you can't predict if a couple will emotionally connect, and you can't predict the physical attraction. But so many people put such a focus on those other two, and they don't even like allow that maybe they might not have exactly those intellectual and, you know, those two things, the spiritual, but the other two might be so overpoweringly, you know, coordinated that it might be worth it. They might just continue dating because those two work. And other things they could be more flexible on. Like, it's a shame there's so much of a focus on two, and then the other two are like, you know, we'll see, they're not as focused on it to get them on a date. You know, like I tried setting someone up recently, and I thought it was a great idea. I even had someone else who was trying to push it forward, also thought it was a great idea. But someone else, the mother of the boy asked, said, I don't see it. And that was it. Because that one person didn't see it, the shidduch, she said no, and that was that. So, like, there's just so little flexibility here. It's upsetting, but I love your breaking down, because those 4 categories are so crucial. And the idea of being flexible is so important when it comes to dating someone and progressing in these different stages. And then certainly that's great premarital education, because that's what a marriage is. I mean, you have to give in, you have to be flexible, you have to understand each other. And I mean, all of that is so crucial. Not everyone is ready and prepared with that when they get married, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's interesting when you say about the 2 sets of categories. I had written about this a bunch of years ago in an article. And one of the things that I noticed is, I think in the more shidduch dating, more kind of right-wing world, there's much more of the focus on the logistical, pragmatic, intellectual compatibility and the religious stripe alignment. Also a lot on family compatibility, which again, that's not nothing, but it's certainly not everything. And less encouragement to think about, you know, how you feel emotionally, what kind of attraction you're feeling. In fact, a lot of times that's discredited. I can't even tell you how many young people have told me, even after they're married, like, oh, you know, my parents, my Rabbi, my seminary teacher told me, like, don't worry, that comes after the marriage. And then when it doesn't come after the marriage, nobody's like talking about it publicly, and then they end up in therapy. Whereas I think in more, certainly more in the secular arena, but also more relationship styles, dating styles that mimic more of the secular arena. There's a lot of focus on too much on, the emotional and physical attraction, and less on the pragmatics and the emotional and the intellectual and spiritual stuff. And so very often they'll run into this, well, we fell in love with each other, we've been dating for a year and a half, and we just found out one of us doesn't want to have kids and the other one does. It's like, well, that's kind of a big deal. You can't have half a kid, So I don't think there's any one community or society or system that has this down pat perfectly. And it's very hard because people are packages and there's not templates, and we all have to pivot in life. But that's why I feel like, they say real estate, location, and in marriage and shidduchim, it's midos, like just being someone who has the humility, the empathy, the sincerity of just like, I want to do what's right. I want to do what I believe God wants us to do. I want to do what's in the best interest of my relationship, of my partner, of our family or future family. And yes, of myself, I don't want to let myself get lost in this process either, but I want to have that rightful, I mean, I'm nili, but if I'm only, lat's me ma'ani kind of thing.
I have a two-part question about love languages, Chapman's love languages, and that, if you're speaking different languages, you're simply not going to understand each other. You need to know, and maybe you could develop what those love languages are, and knowing yourself and knowing the other. What role is that in shidduch dating and engagement? When should that be introduced to the relationship so that, because maybe there's an incompatibility there, and that could be navigated, the incompatibility, as long as you have a willingness to learn a new language or to speak someone else's language, even if it never becomes fully your own. Does it belong, not belong? That's part one. And the part two of the question, I'm sorry, I'm asking you both at once. I was recently trying to offer some chizuk to a couple. I always refer to an actual therapist, but my rabbinic role offer chizuk. And they were sharing with me one of the challenges they were having. The husband doesn't show affection, neither verbal nor physical, publicly. And because that's the way he was raised, he never saw it. His parents have been married a long time. He has many siblings, but his parents never touched each other in front of their children. I don't mean in public, and I don't mean inappropriate, excessive touching, but I mean even any level of connection of affection that showed that they were married to one another. They might as well have been strangers by the way they interacted at home in privacy in front of the children. And he said growing up that way conditioned him to not be predisposed to showing affection, and that was causing tension in their marriage. Do you think it's important for a couple, within boundaries, appropriately, of course, but for their children to grow up knowing what it looks like to see verbal and even a physical appropriate affection, that there is a connection, that these aren't strangers, that there is some level of a connection? I know there's a two-part question, but they overlap. So I'm getting away with it.
I kind of want to not be Meshiv al Rishon. I want to start with the Achron with permission to do that, even if it makes me not smart. So just because the second question is an easier answer for me. I know that I'm trying to okay, I'm going to tell you a personal story and then we'll decide if we want to edit it out. When many years ago, when we were newlyweds, my husband and I got told off for holding hands in public by a rabbinic person whom we respected. And I was like all annoyed about it. I was like, that can't be right. And then I looked it up in the Shulchan Aruch. I'm like, darn, it's true. I found it right there in Ezer. And then over time, we, I worked with a lot of couples, and this is something that we've sort of, it comes up a lot, that what you just described, the issue of, I grew up in a home where my parents definitely cared for each other, but they weren't very affectionate. And so I'm not used to, I don't have a paradigm, I don't have a frame of reference for showing affection. Is something that comes up a tremendous amount in working with couples, because whether you are someone who wants to have a very similar marriage to your parents, which I think is a minority of people, the majority of people I find don't, even people who feel that they love their parents and their parents had a good marriage, they don't necessarily want to have the exact same type of relationship that they saw growing up. But even if you did, there's another person involved, and that person is coming with his or her own set of assumptions of what they're either responding to, being inspired by, or reacting to and not wanting to do. So it gets confusing. It gets messy. I happen to be a fan. I understand that there are halachic, considerations and hashkafic sensitivities with regard to, when and where and to what extent a couple should be touching A, in public, or B, even in front of their own children. But like you said, there's a very, very clear demarcation between, appropriate, affectionate, G-rated touch and more intimate kind of touching, which should really be, private for a couple. I think it's really wonderful and healthy for children to see, appropriate, affectionate touch between parents, and not just touch, but affection between parents, them calling each other loving names, them speaking to each other in a way that's, again, appropriately levels of flirtatiousness and warmth and sweetness, so that they could know, hey, my parents love each other. It's really good for kids to grow up in a home where they feel like their parents love each other, and also good for them to be able to see what it looks like to treat a spouse with that level of affection and affinity. So I'm a big fan of that. But that being said, I don't want to put all the responsibility on the parents. At the end of the day, people need to learn each other's needs and love languages. And that goes back to the question of love languages. The Chapman book, actually, I'm pretty sure, I haven't read it for in a while, but I'm pretty sure he says that it's most typical that people do marry or partner with others who do not share their primary love languages. That's very typical, because we're often attracted towards something that's different than we are. And even if you're with someone who overlaps a little bit in terms of their preferred love language, the way that looks to different people is going to be different depending on, their histories. I had a really interesting situation. This is like, I'm changing the details a little bit, and anyway, the client who had this gave me permission to share it because it was such a profound and important story. But I'm going to share the edited version anyway. So let's say the woman grew up in a physically and emotionally abusive home. And so she's in this relationship now with this man that she loves, but he loves her, and she doesn't want him to say I love you to her, right? Why not? Because when her parents used to punish her, they would say, we're doing this because we love you. So love was a very poisoned and tainted word and statement to her, and so she would get scared from the words I love you. So the guy's like, well, so now I'm never allowed to say I love you to my wife. And it's a quandary, you feel for her. You don't want her to get triggered from her trauma. You feel for him. He should be able to express love for his wife. And so what we did was we came up with a different way for him to be able to share his love, just different language, just say it in a different language, in Hebrew and French and Spanish, or just say, you're the greatest. I'm so happy to be with you, just different ways. And eventually over time, but we're talking years, it got to the point where, she was able, her nervous system was able to reprogram what love meant, and they could use the word love, but it didn't necessarily have to get there. Like, it could be that she could just never hear the word love. So that's a great example where even if her love language had been words of affirmation, that particular word of affirmation was fraught with trauma. Did you want me to quickly go through the love languages?
Sure.
Listeners. Okay, so let's see if I remember all of them. I think there's words of affirmation, there's affectionate touch, there's acts of service, there's gifts, and there's spending time together. And so his theory, which I think is a very true theory, is that most of us have, one or two primary ways that we receive and like to give love. And we often tend to assume that other people enjoy feeling loved and cared for the same way that we do. So if I like to write long, loving letters to the people that I care about, I'm hoping that they may do that for me. And if I don't specifically enjoy getting gifts, then I wouldn't really think to get a thoughtful gift for someone, because it's just I don't need to clutter up their house. I'll just write them a really nice card or whatever, So, so that's the idea of love languages. And like you said, when people are dating in a halachic way, certainly, physical touch is going to be something that's going to be more of a hypothetical, but you kind of know whether you're kind of a huggy, cuddly personality, probably just based on how you've been with family and friends, if you crave touch. But the other love languages are certainly things that you can explore. I think Chapman has an online test that you can take, just, a lot of examples to gauge and figure out what you like. I don't think it inherently is a problem to have a different love language than your partner, because part of empathy and being an emotionally intelligent person who can think abstractly is to say, I'm not here to give you the gift that I want. I'm here to give you the gift that you want, right? And so I can do the thing for you that you're going to enjoy, but don't do that for me. Let's say, it happens to be my husband and I both hate surprise parties, but if he likes surprise parties and I hate them, I would make him a surprise party, but I would want him to swear never to make me one, right? So, part of being in a good relationship is saying I'm not the same thing as you. I'm willing to hold space for the fact that we have differences, and again, understand it's not even about agreeing or disagreeing, although sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just a matter of al-tam variach and litvakech, you don't have to argue. It's just you're you, I'm me, and I want to do the things that feel good for you, assuming that it doesn't cause any harm to me.
Chavid, jump in.
Jump in. Okay. I love that. That's very true. And I think it's important for couples to understand that. Sometimes they are so makbid on their own and think the others want that too. And you have to, there's a flexibility piece. Be flexible and be curious about what the other person wants and not just about what your own.
I have on the shidduch resume. Should list your love language on the shidduch resume.
It's true. And also, you know, our daughter just got engaged. They actually had a date, their 5th or 6th day, whatever it was, where they took out that game, Perfect Matches. I'm sure you've heard of that game. And it was amazing. Like, it really propelled their relationship because it threw out so many questions about all of their different, like what they each like and their different styles and, you know, where they're going to see each other in 5 years, like all those kind of questions that you may not get to on the typical, you know, situation with anyone all the time. But here, like, to put it into dating and to really ask those guided questions that bring you into such important subjects and really help you get to know each other. That was very helpful. I don't know if they have that question in there because maybe it's for later on, but it's definitely a good thing to explore. We always talk about, you know, when you go on like on a date night, right? When I teach college, I emphasize how important it is to, you know, make sure that couples are going on dates, that you're still dating even when you're married, and, you know, how it's very nice when you're dating, but when you're married, you also need that time together, and to make it more effective, that you're not just sitting there on your cell phones or just having a nice meal, but you're using the time to really ask good questions, have good conversation, talk about things that you don't often talk about, that's not on your to-do list, and, you know, but really getting to know each other. So there's definitely a lot that you could do before marriage, during marriage, and I think this is great. I have another question for you. I was always curious about a perspective from a therapist. There's a lot of focus, and there has been for so many years, but I feel like I hear it even more now, the catchphrase of Amunas Chachamim, of, you know, ask a Rav, make yourself a Rav, you know, whatever the rabbi says, you know, speak to your rabbi. And again, we put a tremendous emphasis on it because we know that rabbis are trained to answer shilos and to even to an extent help with relationships, with marriages, with, you know, with different aspects of a couple, of a person. There's so much that they could do to enhance our lives and to help. But as a therapist, where have you found that it's like an ad kan? Like, is there certain areas where it's really important for a couple or a person to know that's out of the purview of a Rav? Make sure you're going to the proper address for it. And this could go for college teachers and mentors and anyone who's in that position, dating coaches, whatever it is. There's so many, and I don't put rabbis in the same category. Of course, it's a different kind of position where they're coming with all the halachic backing and the knowledge and the, you know, the wherewithal. But at the same time, you know, every human is fallible, and not everyone knows everything and what to say always. And so how do you view that as a therapist? And where are you seeing the pitfalls, the benefits, the different sides of that whole concept?
It's such a rich question, and it's so important. I would say that in my experience, so much of that depends on the philosophical or hashkafic orientation of the two parties that we're dealing with, because it's so easy to sort of outsource our lives. Like, it's so tempting to just treat the rabbi or the mentor as a navi and say, like, okay, you know, where should we live? What should I do? What, you know, should I take the job? Should we have another baby? Should we do, you know, and, you know, I understand that my perspective on this is going to very much be shaped by my own background and my own experiences. So it's not, I don't claim to represent all therapists, and not even all Orthodox therapists. What I like to do is kind of scope out what's going on with my clients. So if they're both the kind of people who were very much, not just because they were told to believe this, but they truly in their hearts believe, like, when we're at any kind of a suffix, we go speak to our Das Torah that we both love and respect and feel understood by and validated by, then that can be a phenomenal resource for them. But sometimes it's not that simple. My own hashkafa is that when I have a halachic shaila, you know, did I treif up the pot or not? I'm completely mevatel das to my rabbi. Do I have to throw away the pot, or is there a way for me to kasher it? You know, I didn't do a smicha, I don't know. But when I'm asking suggestions, you know, I'm asking more sort of like hashkafic or relational or life planning advice, I look at, you know, rabbinic personalities as a resource. You know, as Eta, like I want to get, you know, maybe divrei bracha, or I want to get like the benefit of the wisdom of someone who's learned a lot of Torah and lived more years than I have and spoken to people, you know, in a cross section different than I have. But at the end of the day, and I think that the rabbis that I, you know, speak to would back this up as being hashkafically sound, like, we have our own bechira. That's a gift that Hashem gave us. And so my hashkaf, again, I'm speaking for myself, is that I view it as still my responsibility and my privilege to make a decision, again, with, you know, advice and guidance that I, you know, can sort of adapt as needed. And I think that sometimes people do get tripped up where one party thinks like, okay, well, the rabbi said we have to do A, B, or C. And it could be that the other partner didn't even speak to the rabbi and the other person is just acting as like the spokesperson of the rabbi. Maybe the rabbi didn't even say that exactly or know the other person's perspective, which would have changed his psak or his eitzah or, you know, so I am a little bit like skeptical of, you know, kind of using rabbinic or even psychotherapeutic advice as sort of a unilateral decisor, you know, like if somebody says, well, my therapist said I should do, okay, well, your therapist is in your corner, but what about, you know, so I think that's, you know, something that's very delicate and has to be handled with seichel.
It's a great question, and Yocheved asked it, and you answered it from the perspective of the couple, of the recipient of this das Torah. Let me ask you as a rabbi, because you know, and I appreciate the confidence Yocheved just said, and to a degree you did also about rabbinic training and Masorah and Rebbeim and whatever Torah or halachic knowledge we have does position and empower us and experience, and it's an honor and an awesome responsibility. But I think that Rabbanim also have to know how to stay in their lane. Like, this is what we're trained for. This is what we can offer. We can complement or supplement, but we don't have a direct training, and we're not positioned directly. And this seems to be a growing challenge in other areas. And I guess this is the second tier of the same question, which is, do enough people know how to stay in their lane? Be it the Kala teacher and Chassan teacher, who, aside from just teaching harchakos and calculating onos, are now acting as sometimes beyond the scope of what they should be doing. Be it, you know, we have new arenas and careers of dating coaches and life coaches who didn't go to school and aren't licensed and aren't trained, who may have great instinct and have a lot of wisdom and are wonderful. And I'm not sharing this critical of them, but do you think that in our world at large, we all have to be much more careful to know where our wisdom, how far it goes, and where our training stops, and when we need to refer, and how we can all stay in our lane a little better?
Yeah, this is definitely a topic that comes up a lot in the licensed professional field. You know, therapists who get frustrated with people who give therapeutic style advice, even if they're not qualified to do so. I happen to be a little bit of a minority opinion here. Like the baseline of people should stay in their professional lanes, like within the scope of our training, I 100% do agree with. But I also think that there are many, many licensed professionals who get it wrong when it comes to certain individual people and advice, and likewise, you know, medical doctors, right? I'll go to a medical doctor and I'll listen to her or his advice on what I should do. But at the end of the day, they went to medical school, and so they know a lot more about medicine than I do. But I've been living in my body my whole life, and so I trust my own instincts a little bit about my body. Not to say like I know better than the doctor, but I may want to go for another opinion, or, you know, which again, within halacha, that's a little more complex. But in terms of advice, I would like to put a little bit more of the autonomy and self-determination on the consumer of information, to sort of say, you know, I spoke to this therapist, this doctor, this dating coach, this rabbi, or whatever, and I appreciated their expertise that they shared, whether it was officially in their lane or maybe a little bit venturing out of their lane. But you know, at the end of the day, they have to decide, does that resonate with my sense of what I believe Hashem wants from me, what I believe is going to be good for me and my relationship or my partner or my children, whatever it is that we're getting advice about. So yeah, I obviously think it's really important that we should stay in our lanes. I don't paskin halacha. If the client says, wait, are you allowed to do that according to halacha? I can sort of say, well, you know, I've asked my shaila, but you can ask yours, or I've seen this in the Shulchan Aruch, but I know there's a lot of other opinions out there. You know, I can share the same way. Like if I tell people, you know, we don't drive on Shabbos, I'm not paskening. I'm just sharing my knowledge of, you know, what halacha is, but then there's different permutations and iterations of more nuanced and complex applications of halacha that I'm not, you know, same thing with health. Like I'm not a medical doctor, but there are things I know that are bad for my health and the things that I know that are good for my health, but I wouldn't, you know, prescribe on that basis. So I think the lanes are getting really messy in life and in the world. You know, we have so much information at our fingertips. You know, we are the last generation of people, I think, that we grew up without the internet, and then it came on the scene in our adult years. And so we remember what the world was like when it was, you know, a little bit more striated and organized in that way. And now you can just Google anything and become an expert. You know, I can get, you know, smicha from Google. I can go to medical school and on Google, I can, you know, it becomes just a lot trickier because we feel a lot more entitled and empowered to have opinions. Yeah. And I do appreciate rabbinic wisdom. You know, people will get, let's say, child development advice from their pediatrician. And I've heard some spectacularly terrible advice, that pediatricians have given families. It's like, you check the ear infections, please. But that doesn't mean that a pediatrician can't be a wonderful resource for, parenting guidance. They can be, so I think at the end of the day, we need to do, whenever somebody's in a position of influence, we need to take serious responsibility for what we say and what we do. We need to say it with humility, say, listen, this is just one person's opinion or even one professional opinion. There's a lot of other opinions out there. And to say that, like, what I'm saying might ring true for some people, but not others. There's a lot of gray area, again, whether I'm a licensed professional or not, and I really empower people to not be mevatel das most of the time.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I would give you only a little bit of pushback. That I understand the idea of making the consumer be judicious and educated and careful. But I think that we live in such a superficial world that within the Frum community and outside of it, there are people who are celebrated as they're amazing. They're so inspiring. People flock. They pack the house. They're presenting all this pseudo psychology relationship advice. And you're right. Maybe they intuit much of it. Maybe they're fantastic. Maybe they're changing lives. Maybe they're grossly irresponsible. Maybe they have no idea what they're saying, but they say it so well and so gripping that you listen. Or maybe your Kala or Chassan teacher has shared with you the secrets of such intimacy, and you've made yourself so vulnerable that now you also listen to them, when they call the morning after the wedding to find out how it went, and they're curious about how it's going in your marriage, and you're like, Ad Khan, like, there's a lane here. This is what you provide for me that's meaningful. Now you've overstepped. So to a degree, in life in general, with the internet and the information age, we all have to be much more judicious consumers. But on the other hand, we as a community maybe have to offer some protections for the vulnerable who could easily fall prey to the people who are selling something that they're not in a position to do.
Well, I want to be someone with whom it's safe to disagree, but I'm not sure that I heard anything I disagree with there.
Okay. So then I'm not pushing back. We agree.
I was waiting for the pushback.
What a disappointment.
No, I think we're describing opposite sides of the same coin, meaning as someone who speaks and writes, while I was in grad school, I was a teacher, and I would literally mutter before I would walk into a classroom, Hashem sifatai tiftachu fi agiti lasecha, and afterwards I would say you the Raton refi ve'gelni bi'levanecha Hashem tzrigali, because it was just such a tremendous and awe-inspiring responsibility, and I still think that before I go into sessions and before I go and give a lecture, before I hit publish on a blog post or an article, because like I was saying before, things that I look back on having opined in such a black and white, clear, this is right, this is true, this MS, this is going to help people, this is going to save lives. Years ago, I might have more sort of caveats and exceptions and, qualifications at this point where it's okay, but I've lived a little more life and I've seen a little bit more, of other people's stories. And, I'm going to kind of add to that or amend that or change that a little bit. And so I think that on the part of people who speak and teach and publish and write, we do owe it to ourselves and to God and to the people that are reading and listening to us to try to be as truthful and integrity-based and evidence-based where applicable as we can be. And that's true whether we're licensed professionals, whether we're credentialed with smicha or something concretely, a credential like letters after a name, or something that's more of an abstraction, like teachers, chassan and kala teachers, which is not as standardized as far as I know. And I think we owe it to ourselves to be as educated and aware and knowledgeable as we can be, and also humble and say what I am teaching and what I'm saying right now makes sense to me based on what I've learned, what I've experienced, what I've heard from people. But there's always room for exceptions. There's always room for possible differences. But I think that part of the cultural challenge that we have, and I think this is true in the Frum world, and I think it's true in the world at large, is balancing on the one hand a respect for expertise and intellectual authority or religious authority, which is can be a very valuable and healthy and important thing, but also trusting the kol demama daka inside of us, and knowing what that person is saying might be, there's the medium and there's the message. So sometimes, like you said, the medium is so compelling, is so riveting and inspiring that they can actually give over a really corrupt message and it feels right because it's so pretty. And sometimes the opposite. Sometimes the person will be saying something that's very real and very true and very, very important. But if they're not saying it in a way that's palatable, it might be rejected. And so both of those things are kind of like in the mix. And as a consumer of information, someone who reads and listens and watches information, it's my job to have a filter and sort of say that message there is for me. And I think this is true in Torah also. The Gemara says this, that we have to be discerning about from whom and when and where we receive our Torah and make sure it's what my neshama needs right now. And then I'm not interpreting it on like an OCD level of scrupulosity, or I'm not corrupting it into something that's just self-serving. And, because it's so easy to make Torah into something that's just a weapon for me to use to think poorly of other people or to promote my own agenda. And I think that's true of mental health advice. It could even be true of medical advice. So there's an element of siyata dishmaya that we need both when conveying knowledge and when internalizing knowledge. It kind of goes back to that communications theory stuff.
Right.
I love what you said, because I think you're absolutely right. I think that the professional has to understand this is about the person who's sitting in front of me, whether that's the shotgun who so badly wants another, shidduch on their belt and wants to push it through because it'll be number 18 and whatever it is, have to realize, let's see what this couple needs. What is this boy feeling? What's this girl feeling? A therapist has to know, what is this girl? What do they need? What do they want? And help them figure that out. That's not just, I have to put on my feeling and my impression and what they need to help them understand themselves. And again, like we were talking about before, I think kids today, teenagers, 20 somethings, they have a hard time understanding themselves. They want other people to make those decisions for them. And as professionals and colleges and everyone has to feel like we are guiding them where they're at and what their need, their individual neshama, who they are, what's right for them. That's our job, to do what they want, what is in their best interest, not what I feel is right or what I think. It's a very important, it's a tough balance, because you sometimes want to be that authority, but you also have to work with the person who's sitting in front of you. So.
Totally. I think it's the hardest with parenting, right? Like to get my own ego out of the way and like tell my child what's right for them versus what I want to be right for them. Right.
Yeah. And by the way, that's another point, by the way, that with these professions, the parents are often being taken out of the equation, which my husband and I talk about a lot. But like, a lot of these professionals are coming in and kind of taking on roles that in other times parents might have filled those roles, taught their kids certain things, helped their kids in certain areas, guided them. Now it's like the Rabbi and the teacher, and they're taken on a lot of those decisions and those guiding roles. And that's also something that we have to balance a little bit and maybe bring back somehow today, because parents really know their kids so well and could be that authority figure or that guiding light in their lives. So it's also a balance.
Yeah, I worry about that sometimes. I worry about how trendy it is to disqualify parents in favor of the therapist, the seminary teacher, the rabbanim. I think that like the very wise, rabbanim and seminary teachers and therapists will not be so quick to just sort of say like, your parents don't know what they're talking about, listen to me. They'll be more like, okay, well, let's talk about, because your parents, obviously there are exceptions where there's, true, abuse and dysfunction, and that has to be acknowledged. But, I think in a lot of the cases where we hear people disparaging parental mistakes or parental roles in their children's lives, it would be much healthier and much more useful to help facilitate more healthy, loving, or boundaried, or just better communication relationships between parents and adult children, rather than being so quick to sort of disqualify.
It actually comes back to what you said before. The same way that the doctor may academically know about a person's body, but they know their own body. How many stories do we have about that mother who, even when the doctor said everything was okay, said, no, I know my child and something's wrong. So there's that parental instinct that no matter how close you are with another, the parent has an instinct that almost supersedes the other. And again, there are many parents who are terrible parents and deserve to a degree be disqualified, or at least be one opinion, but not the authoritative one. Parents are not always right, but they're also not always wrong. And there is a role for those parents, and particularly their instinct in knowing what's right, what's healthy, what's going well, and having some influence. You've been very generous with your time, and we're going to wind down because it's been a great conversation. We could talk for hours more. There's so much more to talk about. I want to ask you, in your position as a therapist, and with the view or perspective that you have of, let's call it the Torah community, the Orthodox community, the community that you work with, what are issues, or what is something that you think is really important and we're not speaking about it enough? What is something among children and parents, in marriage, in our own personal psychological profile, mental health, well-being that really is important, and yet nobody's talking, or we're not speaking about it enough? And what is something that we seem obsessed with talking about, but really it doesn't deserve the attention that we're giving it? We're talking about it all the time, but really in the scheme of things, it doesn't deserve the level of attention it's getting.
Okay, you might want to delete my answer, but something that I wish we did more of, and I shouldn't say wish because that implies that there's no progress. There is progress in this area, is because I have this sort of accidental specialty treating sexual dysfunction primarily within marriages. I feel like not all, but a tremendous percentage of the pain and the suffering that I see in marriages, in the intimate area of marriage, could be either prevented or mitigated by better premarital sexual education. And when I say premarital, I don't just mean in the 20 minutes before they get married by the chassan and kala teachers. I almost don't think it's even fair what we expect the chassan and kala teachers to accomplish in the months of the engagement. I feel like that's something I've written extensively about, and I have a course on it, the Sex Ed Guide for Religious Parents. I feel like that could make a huge difference. I can't say that's like the big issue in the firm community because, when you're a carpenter, you think everything is a hammer and a nail, but this is what I do. So this is where I see a lot of problems that don't get talked about. I think with the amount of solution-oriented problem solving that would be important to do. Although that being said, I think in the last 10 years, I've seen a tremendous amount of growth in people's willingness to discuss this, and even in the very firm community. So that's promising, but we have a lot more to go. And the other thing that, and again, we didn't, it could be that if I had read these questions before, I would have had different answers, but answering on the fly, something that I think we talk too much about, tznius. I think it's become a little bit of an obsession in girls' chinuch to the point where it's like, it's the amount of focus and emphasis and minutia that gets overly addressed and processed is just it's creating a neurosis. Meaning in terms of over focusing on it to the point where it becomes too important, and creating a rebellion where it gets to the point where people are so disgusted that they reject even true halacha because of the amount of hyper focus and intensity and chumrah that's been piled on. So there's a lot to be said on that, but
is it possible the overemphasis on extreme modesty is a response to the world around us moving towards extreme immodesty? The more immodest the world around us becomes, which it is in terms of the images that even one trying to avoid can't help but see on billboards on a highway, or interacting with technology at any level, or just going to an airport or to a store. So the more immodest the world becomes, the more obsessed with modesty we become. Not to suggest that that's working or that that's a effective response, but it almost seems like it is the knee-jerk response. Could you paint a picture? I know you were just on halachic headlines about this subject, but the answer would, if there's too much emphasis or obsession, the answer wouldn't be not to talk about it at all or have any expectations at all, right? Meaning, how do we raise our daughters? Where do we draw those lines or boundaries? If they are pushing back or challenging them, do we ignore? Do we look the other way? Do we let them on our credit card buy whatever clothing they want, walk out of our house in whatever state of dress they want, listen to whatever music or watch whatever media they want? How do we find that healthy medium to address it? Because it's such a dangerous world in terms of particularly the media and the messages and the images, and not become hyper-focused that we're being counterproductive.
So I think it's almost not fair to get into that in the last 2 minutes of a conversation. It deserves its own conversation. But just again, al regalachas, to answer the first thing that you said, which was oh no, I forgot what was the
hyper immodesty leads to hyper modesty.
Yes, thank you. Yes, exactly. I think that piece of it, there's a yin and a yang. When I was in high school, I read there's theorist Hegel, and Hegel talks about thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? And so there's the thesis was the whole world was tsanua until maybe 100, 200 years ago. There wasn't a discussion about tznius because the standards, societal standards of decency were somewhat universal in most civilized societies, and it only in sort of the post the 50s and 60s, where the world started to change so radically, the sexual revolution and the way people, engaged with each other sexually and it presented themselves physically became so dramatically different that there had to be this like kind of extreme response to it. And so, what would have been considered norms of decency and modesty and, abstinence, a couple hundred years ago is now extremist by today's standards. And so it's very confusing. So I think that's something that has to be contended with. And I don't think that it shouldn't be taught or discussed at all. I just think the extent to which it's, both the way that it's given over and the extent to which it's given over, like at the expense of other more healthy, uplifting, inspiring, internally focused messaging is what creates a lot of this like negativity for people. And I thought you were going to ask, is there a connection between people's with problems that we see sexually and the hyper focus on modesty? And I do think that that's also true. When you have like 20 years in certain communities, when you have 20 years of like really intense continuous education, and then you expect people to be able to get married and enjoy each other in a way that's very disinhibited, it's very hard to undo. And that's why, part of what I really would love to see happen is more integrated messaging, people being able to be in touch with their bodies and their selves and their feelings and their desires, and also understand that there's an appropriate and halakhically sanctioned context for it, rather than like, surprise, you're engaged now, let me tell you about this,
And I think you touched also, you said the chumrah is, your answer is basically two sides of the same coin. And what you're saying, it is very connected, that does become problematic when it's such a focus and it's such an emphasis and it defines so many of these girls as they're growing up. And then all of a sudden you're supposed to be teaching them, okay, now you're married. And they're like, what? It does become very difficult and uncharted waters. Girls have definitely a hard time adjusting to that, certainly more than the boys. And I think what you said is so true. And I also think the idea of the whole chumrah part of it, where, girls are in a certain community, feel a certain way that they're doing more, but the more is not necessarily halachically based. And then it becomes confusing. What's the line? And so all of what you said was.
We're going to have to continue this conversation. We had many questions we didn't even get to, Elisheva, including how to have the talk with one's children, how to teach children to avoid some of the dangers of abuse and things that we see happening in the world, OCD versus scrupulosity. Are people too hard on themselves, too easy on themselves? There was a lot more to talk about. So
why you homeschool kids? That's always interesting.
Yeah, that was also on there. Why you chose homeschooling? Why that's part of your Instagram profile.
So much to learn about you. My goodness. Okay.
We need to have a lot of coffee, guys.
We'll have to continue the conversation. Elisheva, thank you for your time.
It's
thank
always
you for
a
sharing
pleasure
your wisdom.
time with you. Thank you.
I can confidently tell you that we're not going to be editing out any of this. It was all a great conversation and all deserves to be heard and thought about. So thank you so much for your time, and we're looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks for having me. Mazel tov again. Stay.
Wow. You muted
Rabbi Broide, thoughts on the conversation?
I thought it was very, very good. First of all, I love her confidence. I love how she knows what she's talking about. And even when you pushed back, and obviously there's going to be disagreements here and there, but this is a subject which we all need to not only hear about, but we've got to get more involved.
Yeah, marriage and well-being. And it's not only marriage. I know there's a lot of emphasis on that, but just in general, being somebody others can disagree with, friendship, colleagues. There's a lot to say about a work environment where it's safe for people to disagree agreeably, and in the pursuit of truth and to bring out the best in one another. And that's a really important topic. And she's an accomplished therapist in the Efrem community and beyond. And it was a good conversation. A lot of food for thought.
Yeah,
a lot of wisdom.
Really a breath of fresh air. Enjoyed it.
A lot more to talk about there. Again, I want to thank Michelle Diamond, the Diamond family, for sponsoring in memory of our beloved Chaim.
Yeah,
we miss him. And we learned a lot from him, and we still think about him. His neshama should have an aliyah. Sign up for the 1-on-1, brsonline.org/1-and-1. $1 a day, minute a day, means the world to the Moskowitzes. Could be the difference, please God, for those who need her. For Shlema, Esti among them, daven for Esther, Tehila Bas Ariel, Tzipora. And any closing thoughts, Rabbi Broide? Anything going on in your life? Anything new? Anything happening you want to add?
A lot going on right now. Let's just say it's a lot of chaos right now. I'm trying to get control of everything. But it's great.
Make sense. Organize the chaos.
Organize the chaos.
Exactly. We got a great next. We got more than one guest. We are interviewing a few guests from a certain genre, which will be really exciting.
Interesting. I love it.
Yeah, we're not
The
going to
mystery guest. We should play that mystery guest. We don't know who it is, and we have to guess who's coming on.
Mystery guest. We should.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for getting the word out so the wisdom of others can be shared. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy.